Okay, recording has started. Welcome to the April 28th edition of the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall. Today's topic is inference and suggestion questions in reading comprehension. So a topic that has been requested by quite a few of you in the most recent weeks. So good stuff. All right, here's what we're going to do. A quick note about the way this is going to have to proceed. That note is that because we're doing reading comprehension, we are unfortunately going to have to present a new passage with each question that we cover. So the result basically is that we're using short passages only so that the time management doesn't get out of control here. But we will have to present a separate passage with each question. But before we start, we need to go with the usual warnings. So let's get that out of the way. The usual warnings. Okay, first of all the stuff that you're used to hearing me say about what sorts of problems you should submit and what sorts of problems you should not submit. As far as what you should not submit, remember, nothing too general, nothing too specific, so please don't ask a question that amounts to the entire GMAT, like this question here, or a question that is much too broad of a topic area to really be a study hall, like this. But also, this is the more important point, please do not submit problems that are too specific. That's what the forums are for. So if the question is one problem and you just want to know about a couple of answer choices, please do not submit those problems here. Please submit them to the forum. That is the purpose of the forum, is to answer specific questions of that type. Finally, personal issues. If you're going to talk about your own scores or your study plan or the schools to which you want to apply, again, this is not the place. Remember that these recordings are watched by hundreds and in some cases thousands of people. So we really can't be talking about individual study plans and such here. Again, the forums have a folder dedicated to that sort of thing. It's called the General Questions folder. So please post this kind of stuff in the General Questions folder. As far as what you should submit, topics of intermediate depth, like this, or this is another one. This is a nice topic of intermediate depth. It's not all of reading comprehension at once, which would be sort of ridiculous, but it's also not one question. It's a nice middle value. It's a nice focused topic, which is good for the study hall. Alternatively, if you're going to submit a specific problem, as long as there's some sort of more general question that's pertinent to it. Because if you're just submitting one question, again, that should go on the forum, not here. But if you tie it into a more general query, then we'll consider it. Finally, most importantly, no OG problems. In the last 2 weeks, about half of our submissions have been from the official guide. So please do not submit problems from the official guide. We cannot use them. Anything that's a banned source on the forum is also a banned source here. We have the same rules for sources. So make sure you check out the list on the forum before you get started of what is a banned source and what is an allowed source. Finally, please check the archives before you post. So if you're submitting a topic that has already been covered, please check first to make sure that's not the case. We've done about 30 of these study halls by this point, I think more than 30 by now. So there are a lot of things in the archives. So please check first. For example, we've done Strength and Weaken as a dedicated session already. We had a couple people asking about that. Just check the archives. Strength and Weaken is in there. We had a couple people asking about data sufficiency and coordinate geometry. We've actually done 2 sessions on that, among other things. So please check to make sure that we haven't already covered your topic of choice. So those are basically the rules. Again, not too specific, not too general, no personal issues, and no OG problems. And finally, check to make sure we haven't already done it. Smiley face if you understand these rules and are ready to get going. Okay. All right, so again, today's topic is inference questions and reading comprehension. So let's talk about what exactly is an inference in terms of these questions. And in order to discuss that, let's invoke the following example, which is not from the official test, but will help us get grounded in the right sort of way here. So here's an example. Smith has eaten at restaurant X 20 times this year, paying an average of $50 per plate, paying at least $50 per plate every time. 19 of those times, Smith has eaten seafood, paying an average of $75 a plate. So draw the conclusion or inference. I'm going to give you polling buttons in order to do this. Let's see where you guys are with this. What you should see right now is you should see this underneath the names in the top left corner of your screen. You should see polling buttons that say A, B, C. So instead of 1, 2, 3, these are A, B, and C. Go ahead and give me an answer as to which of these you think are inferences. So A, B, or C. Let's see where you guys are at. We've got votes from about half of you. Everybody give me something again so that we know where you guys are. See if we're on the same page. Okay, still waiting on a few people. Okay, here are the class results. Remember, if you didn't vote and you're here, make sure you know the GMAT makes you vote on everything. So, okay, the class was very divided on this issue. We've got more or less comparable numbers of people voting for each of the 3 options. Then we had a few non-voters, as you can see. Let's talk about this. This is a type of question where you can't think like people think in the real world. There are question types whose point is to invoke real-world type thinking, and in fact which can't be solved by logic, such as strengthen, weaken, and so on. No, 3 is supposed to be either one of these 2. So 3 is what you'd vote for if you think you can conclude both of these. Okay. This is not, the thing you've got to know about inferences is that they don't mean what they do in the real world. So let's go back to this, let's take this question to the next page and let's talk about the 2 different approaches to this. The real world approach to this type of question means, like, in the real world, what do people mean by inference? Well, in the real world, the word inference generally signifies that you're making some sort of guess based on what's going on. So it usually means some sort of best guess or hunch based on the information at hand. So, like, in the real world, people would pick number 1. Because they would look at this information and say, wow, 19 times out of 20, that sounds a lot like Smith must like seafood. So, real world individuals in conversation would totally pick number 1. Because they would guess these things. They would say, wow, 19 out of 20 times, that probably means that Smith likes seafood. And $75 sounds like a lot, so it's probably a premium. On the other hand, if you take a rigorous approach, which is not the way people think in the real world, but if you take a rigorous approach that's based on actually trying to prove things, then you would look at number one and you would say, well, we don't really know these. We don't really know either of these things. Because we don't really know that Smith likes seafood. I mean, we know that Smith has eaten it a lot. But there are plenty of other possible explanations for that. For instance, this could be a religious thing. It could be a special diet. Maybe restaurant X only serves seafood except on special occasions. We don't know. So we don't know likes, and we also don't know premium, because premium means more than Smith pays for other food. So both of those, in terms of like actual rigorous logic, if you really get down to it, we don't know these things. These are both unknowns. On the other hand, number two, we can actually prove this statement. Because Smith has eaten at this place 20 times, and exactly 19 of those times were seafood. And so you can take those away. 20 minus 19 is not 0. So there must have been at least one non-seafood occasion. So, I mean, this is absolutely not the way that people think in the real world. But if you are taking a rigorous approach to this sort of thing, then you would conclude not number one, but yes, number two. And it turns out that's the way that inferences work on the GMAT. So we want just the second one of these and not the first one. So as a quick recap, the way that inferences work on the GMAT, the first and most important thing to note is that they do not work like real-world inferences. So when people say the word inference in the real world, that's generally a reference to making a guess, your best guess based on the situation at hand. But it's still a guess. I mean, Smith likes seafood at the end of the day is ultimately a guess based on the evidence in front of us here. We're not certain of that at all. Instead, what you have to do is you need to pick the answer that must be true given the information at hand. You're looking to pick a statement that must be true. Notice this is a very high bar. And so the question is, what kinds of statements are you going to get? And this is a very strict requirement. You can't have any additional assumptions or guesses. You can't guess that anything is true. And so what will usually happen is you will usually end up with an inference that is very close to what is already written in the passage. So close that in some cases it will be practically a restatement of what is already there. In some cases, inferences will almost be restatements of what is already there. For instance, I mean, you might even get so close where it's like if the passage says, I am shorter than my brother, then the inference is my brother is taller than I am. Like, some of them are that close. So this is what we're doing. How inferences work on the GMAT. You got to pick the statement that must be true, and you are not allowed to make additional assumptions. And so what that means in practice is that you usually wind up with something that is very close to the given information. In fact, I bet that more than a couple of you might have rejected answer B because you thought we already knew that. But that's kind of what inferences are. So just remember that it's not like real-world thinking. Okay, there are other question types that require real-world thinking. But these don't allow it at all. I mean, let's talk for a second, before we look at some real GMAT inferences, let's talk for a second about the purpose of this test. Why does the test work the way that it does? Because knowing this can help you get a window into why the test is constructed the way that it is. So how the different types of questions on RC and CR function. Imagine that there's a spectrum of learning here. Or a spectrum of processing questions, a spectrum of thinking about these things, where on one side of the spectrum you have very real-world type thinking. And on the other side of the spectrum you have very much like formal logic, which is nobody really thinks with formal logic in the real world. So these are pretty much opposed to each other. You know, when we're in real world thinking, we're talking about making reasonable assumptions or most probable assumptions. And, you know, taking the most probable guesses based on the situation at hand, etc. As opposed to formal logic where you literally do not assume anything outside of what is given. And you have to, you do not use common sense or most probable interpretations. And instead, you seek to actually prove things. One or the other. And I mean, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the question types that you encounter in reading comp and in critical reasoning they're not in the middle of the spectrum. They're very much on the extremes of the spectrum. So each question type is on an extreme of this spectrum. For instance, we've talked in previous sessions about main idea questions. Main idea questions are over there way on the left. They're very much real-world thinking. So those are over here, main idea questions. In reading comp, there's also the author's purpose type question. That's in here as well. In critical reasoning, you have strength and weaken. You have explain the situation, etc. On the other hand, on the formal logic side of things, you have detail questions or according to the passage type questions. You have draw the conclusion questions, etc. The point is that most people try to go into this with a thought process that is more or less a mix of these two things. Like they're using this hybrid of formal logic and real-world thinking. The problem is that each question type is pretty much purely one or purely the other. Like you need to decide, or you need to know which question types demand which of these types of thinking, and think accordingly. Because if you take the wrong type of thinking into the problem, it's going to be disastrous. It's not going to work out well at all. Because if you take real-world thinking, if you take the questions that are supposed to be based on real-world thinking, those questions will not work with formal logic. So these above types of questions on the left here, these question types are impossible to solve with formal logic. They can't be done. If you take rules and formal logic into these question types, you will not succeed. It will be impossible. And similarly, if you take the question types that are listed over here, then these question types, you'll be misled if you try to use your real-world thinking on these question types by using real-world thinking on these question types. So really there's this issue of knowing exactly which type of thinking is relevant to which question type. So today we're talking about detail and inference questions. So we're on the right-hand side of the spectrum today. Remember, when you take the test, you have to basically be going back and forth constantly between the left and right-hand sides of the spectrum. Because that's what this test is all about. The test is trying to weed out people who are stuck in one mode of thinking or the other. For instance, we get a lot of candidates on the forums and such who try to approach every single question type with formal logic and who don't really use real-world type thinking. I mean, remember what this test is ultimately for. It's a management test, and you don't really want managers who only think in terms of rules and memorization and logic. So the test, as a result, also contains a large number of real-world thinking type questions, especially on critical reasoning. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that your best candidates are also detail-oriented when necessary. So as a result, there are also a fair number of questions that are based on details and are not just based on large-scale thinking. It's a combination of both. But the test wants to make sure that candidates can think on both sides of the spectrum. They want to make sure that you can use formal logic when necessary and get down to the nitty-gritty of the details. But they also want to make sure that you can use real-world thinking when necessary. So the point here, there's 2 points to make. The first point is that today we are over there on the right. Very much so. But then on other question types, you are all the way over to the left. And the art here lies in knowing which side of the spectrum you are on at any given point. So questions about this before we start diving into some problems here. If anybody has questions, go ahead and type them in the text box. Nishant K, I've noticed you've had text in your text box for the last like 5 or 10 minutes. So if you have a question, please type it. If not, please erase the text. Otherwise, if you have questions, please ask them, or else we will move on to a real question. Okay, cool. Let's do it. So I've given you multiple choices A through E. Again, we have to supply you with a passage. So I've tried my best to make this big enough to read, but this is from GMAT Prep. So here's what we're going to do. The passage is up here. I'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes for the combination of the passage and the question. So if you want, you don't have to read the whole passage. Because remember that the answer to the question, remember that these are not based on, so before we start here, let me just make the following comment. How we're going to make this work, what we're going to do. Number one, each question will be presented with a passage. Okay, remember, we're only doing inference or suggestion questions, which are basically the same thing. So you don't necessarily have to read the whole passage today, because we're not going to be testing the main idea or any sort of big picture. We're not doing big picture questions, such as main idea or organization, etc. So instead, if you want to just look for the information in the passage, go ahead. But I'll give you let's say 3 to 4 minutes per question, or until most people have answered. I mean, in other words, we're going to crowdsource here to a certain extent. Once, like, if we have everybody but 3 people have answered, then we'll kind of hurry up those last 3 people so that we can move on here. Gaurav says, can we read the question first and then move on to the passage during the test? During the test, it's not a good idea to do this. We're just talking about today. So in regard to this question, no. During the test, this is a bad idea. Because if you think about the strategy, I mean, the good strategy to use during the test, the good strategy during the test is you read the passage first, looking for main ideas, and we don't want to get too off track with this because today's point is inference questions, but just quickly, you look for main ideas, and then you note the placement of details, but don't worry about what the details are. So, I mean, the advantage of this, the bad strategy is read the question first, then go back and find it. I mean, let's explain why this is a good strategy and why this is a bad strategy. This is a good strategy because if you get a main idea question, you'll know the main idea already. And then if you get detail questions, because you've noted the placement of details in the passage, you're going to know where to look. So you'll save time in hunting because you already know where to hunt. Okay, on the other hand, this is a bad strategy because for main idea questions, you'll have to go back and read the whole thing anyway. So, and then the disadvantage here is that for detail questions, if this is your strategy, you will have no idea where to look. And so it will take you longer to find things. So, I mean, overall, reading the thing first is going to save you time because it's like having a table of contents. That's what we mean by noting placement. It's like making a table of contents in your head. And so that'll help you speed up the process of having to go back and find details. If you don't do that, you're literally, it's like having a brand new passage every time you have a question. In critical reasoning, it's different. In critical reasoning, you should always read the question first. Because in critical reasoning, the question tells you how you should be reading the passage in the first place. So in CR, reading the passage first is a very horrible idea. But here, you should be reading the passage first. So in any case, we're presenting each question with a passage, and then we'll give you 3 or 4 minutes. So let's move on to the first one. Again, quick comment on how to answer the questions. In the corner of your screen, you're going to see these buttons on the left-hand side. Please answer the questions with these buttons. Please do not answer the questions in the text box. Because that way, no one sees each other's answers until we call time. Okay, smiley face if you guys understand and are ready to move on to some questions. Smiley face icon. All right, here's the first one. Go for it. There's a timer. Okay, most people who have answers, we have a Carter at Nick, and we have a Christar who don't have answers. Everybody else does. So let's get that done. Okay, here are the answers from the class. So we had a split here between B and C. Remember that you need to, remember what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we need to pick the answer that you can basically prove to be true with no additional assumptions. Must be true, no additional assumptions. And so usually you will wind up with something that is very, very close to what is already in the passage. So keep that in mind as we look here. They talk about, okay, where you're looking is socialists within the Russian women's movement and most bourgeois feminists believed. So you're looking for something about which these two groups agreed. So that's where we're going to find that over here is you've got the bourgeois feminists and social feminists. So here's the things on which they agree. The first is this one. They both regarded this as the means by which they might attain emancipation. They also recognize enormous difficulties with paid labor and motherhood. In fact, blah, 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 blah. And then finally, they concurred in subordinating women's emancipation to what they considered the more important goal of liberating the population. So your correct answer should be basically equivalent to one of these. That's how these things work. So, and since these are separate facts, you're not really going to combine them in any meaningful way. So they're just going to have to pick one and make an inference based on it. So if you look, there are no choices that have to do with paid labor as the principal means, so that's out. There are no choices that have to do with combining labor and motherhood, so that's out. But there's this one. They concurred in subordinating women's emancipation to more important goals, which is basically exactly the same as this choice. More important goals should take precedence. So, again, notice how exactly this is close to what's written in the passage. It's almost, for all practical purposes, it's exactly the same thing. So this says that X is less important or subordinate to Y, where X is women's emancipation, women's rights, and Y is liberating the Russian population from oppression. And the inference is that Y is more important than X. That's how close we're talking here, people. That is how close you have to stay to the text in order to avoid making additional assumptions. If any of you rejected this because it's the same as what's already there, don't do that. That's how inference questions work. It's basically equivalent to what is already written there. So this says women's rights are less important than liberating the population. Larger aims. This is liberating the population is more important than women's rights. X is less than Y. Y is more than X. Smiley face if you see why that choice is correct. And especially smiley face if you note just how close we are here. We're basically repeating exactly what the passage says. As far as what's wrong with C, The problem with C is this. This is too definite. I mean, would ultimately bring about. There's no evidence in the passage to suggest that, I'm going to fix that typo in a second. There's no evidence to suggest that they actually were this optimistic. Because, I mean, they thought that this would bring about the liberation, is they actually thought that this movement would achieve ultimate success, which there's no predictions in the passage at all about what these things would ultimately accomplish. So if you pick choice C, you're making a random assumption that they thought these things would actually succeed. Whereas, so this is an additional assumption. So you're not allowed to make additional assumptions. Okay, someone writes, I didn't get how B is correct. Please explain what you don't understand, because otherwise I'll just wind up repeating everything that I just said. So, okay, other questions also, please type in the text box. No one picked anything except B and C, really. So we will. No, the word I didn't like in B was should. Well, they concurred in doing this. In other words, they think that this should be done. I mean, there are no additional assumptions here. I mean, you are like, I guess you're assuming that people are doing what they think they should do, but that's not really an additional assumption. I mean, if they agreed that they should do this, then they agree that it should be done. Those are basically equivalent. Last statement says, consider. Right, but that's what says more important. Gaurav, no, it actually says the opposite of that. It says they concurred in subordinating this to these other goals. So subordinating it to other things means that it's less important, not more. So maybe you're reading the word subordinated incorrectly. If X is subordinated to Y, then that means that X is less important. Okay, any other questions, please type in the text box. Otherwise, we will jump to another one of these wonderful things of wonderfulness. Okay, let's do it. Here's another one. Go for it. I'll clear out your answers, and I'll give you another block of time. Do it. Blue line, and if anybody's wondering, the blue line has no significance. It's just something that was in a Word doc in which I compiled these things. So the blue line doesn't mean anything. Okay, let's wrap it up here in a second. We have about 3 people who haven't answered yet. We have a Sudanshu and VN, and that's all right now. So, okay, here are your statistics. The one non-answer is me and another person who is having technical difficulties. So let's kill the non-answer part. So majority of the class picked E this time. Very good. Let's take a look. So what's nice here is that you just have to find this, most existing maps of Native American lands. And you basically just have to find something. Again, what we're doing, find something that is basically equivalent to what is already there concerning existing maps. So most existing maps are reconstructions that are based largely on archaeology, oral reports, and evidence gathered from observers' accounts in letter diaries and official reports. Notice that this says many existing maps. That's just, a fair number of them, but that's not most. So you can ignore the part about many existing maps because the question says which one is true about most existing maps. And remember, it has to be thoroughly based on the information at hand. So if it just says many of them also did this, that's irrelevant. But here, most existing maps do this. So it's going to be some restatement of what's up there. So what's up there is basically they are secondhand. They're based on archaeology, so stuff that people dug up, or oral reports based on stuff that other people said, or based on what other people wrote and in their diaries and in government reports and such things. So in other words, they are not firsthand. Choice E. They are not based on first-hand observations, which is more or less an exact equivalent of the text that's written there in the blue part. They are largely from this second-hand source, that second-hand source, and that second-hand source. So therefore, they are not first-hand. Questions about this? Does anybody have questions about the other answer choices? If you do, then is this on the left end of the spectrum? No, it's not. I mean, here's our spectrum. All of these inference questions are going to be very much towards the right of our spectrum here. We're still talking about not assuming anything outside and not using common sense stuff. You're just proving things. Like if you look at the information at hand here, you're definitely not making any additional assumptions. Like this is basically a restatement of this. Like there's no real world reasoning in this question at all. It's basically just stating the same information in opposite ways. Like, most of this coffee comes from South America. Okay, most of this coffee does not come from North America. It's not a real world thinking type question. It's a very logical, rigorous type question. No, most is not the same as many. When they say many, usually the implication is not a majority. So if you say, like, many of this school's students get into Ivy League schools, that would usually mean that it's less than half, but it's still a fair number. So that's the usual understanding of when they say many of these. It is not a majority. Because the idea is that if it were a majority, then that would be made clear. They would actually say most. But the most important part of that is just that you don't need to get super quantitative with that. Like what you don't need and what you shouldn't worry about is like exact percentages for these things. Just make sure you know that many is a weaker statement than most. And that usually many is employed to specifically imply that it's not a majority. Okay, looks like one other person is typing a question, and otherwise we will move on to something else. Well, I mean, in response to that, the text box says, you need to remember, that's what we said to you that you're doing here. The good strategy that you actually want to use during the test is to do that, to note the placement of details, but not worry about it. So when you read the passage, you would say, okay, here's where they're talking about most maps, and so you would just remember that. most existing maps, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm just going to remember where I saw that. Maybe make a brief note. I mean, today, if you really want to, you can always just go looking for this phrase. I mean, suggests which of the following about most existing maps. I mean, when you do these today, you can always just go find that and then reason from there. But on test day, that's of course a very bad idea, because if you did that, you would have to go search through the passage as if it were brand new every single time. But today you can follow either of those approaches, whichever one. Because the point of today is not the locating part. It's the making sure you know how to reason through these questions part. Like making sure you know how they work and how they don't work. So there's really no difference with except questions, except that you need to find 4 that are like this and 1 that's not. But the form of reasoning is not any different. You just have to realize that 4 of the answer choices will do this and 1 won't. So the main order of business with those kinds of questions is not to get confused. But as long as you understand that you're looking for the one answer that doesn't do this, then you're fine. Okay, let's move on to another one. Let's look at, let's say, how about this right here? Okay, go for it. Here's your timer. Have fun. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's pick answers, please. We have, let's see, Dinesh is still, then VN. We still need answers from you guys. So let's get something, please. The highlighted text, sorry, I wasn't looking at the window while Jay-Z, while you asked the question. The highlighted text is the boldface text right here. So the dominant view is up there. It should appear on your screen in text that is boldface relative to the rest of the text around it. Okay. It can be inferred. So here are the class statistics. We have a Dinesh who still hasn't answered yet. Make sure that you, again, we can't wait for one person, but we need to move on. Make sure you know that on the GMAT you have to answer the questions. So you don't have this option of not answering the questions. It'll be actually highlighted, but I made it in a Word doc by transcribing from GMAT Prep. So. But on the GMAT, it should actually show up as highlighted, yes. Okay. Here's the class answers. Most of you selected, not a majority, but the most popular answer was D, which is good. D is what we want. But let's take a look. Again, the point here that you've got to keep in mind, there are 2 points to keep in mind. So remember, you need to prove the statement, so as a result it should be approximately equivalent to what's already written. Okay, the statement should be basically the same as what is already there. And then also it should be localized, meaning you should not have to hunt all over the passage for stuff. So if they're talking about the dominant view in recent decades, then that's what they're talking about, and you should be able to find the relevant information in that close neighborhood of what they're talking about. Because, for instance, this passage does discuss a couple of other views that are not the dominant view. For example, you have another view claims that, so this stuff is irrelevant, and more recent field work has shown that this stuff is also irrelevant, because these things are not the highlighted view. So these two are not the view that you are asked to consider in this case. So remember that in addition to knowing how you have to think about these things, you also have to know that you also have to keep close track of what they're asking you about and what they're not asking you about. Because in this case, they're only asking a question about this dominant view. And so if you consider other views presented in the passage, that's a mistake. So the dominant view is that, and then also we're looking at the origin of the hunting territories. So where do they come from? Well, it says they were not found among Algonquians before contact with Europeans, but are the result of changes brought about by the European Algonquian fur trade, in combination with factors such as ecological changes and consequent shifts in wildlife harvesting patterns. So what we've got here is this. They don't talk about shifts in wildlife harvesting in the choices, and they don't talk about ecological changes in the choices. So we're left with the European Algonquian fur trade. In other words, contact with Europeans. So this is D. As usual, by this point, now you know what's going on. They're basically just saying, in other words, what is already stated up there. In this case, this is as usual, it's an almost exact restatement. This is almost an exact restatement of what is given up there. So, how do we choose between D and E? Well, D is correct and E is incorrect. Like, it never talks about non-Algonquian Indian tribes. It talks about trade with Europeans, and it's the only trade that it talks about. And it doesn't, like, this whole thing of trade with non-Algonquian tribes is not there. It never talks about that. So that's how you make that decision. Okay, the text box says, how do we filter the information? Well, this is why we're making such a big deal of the fact that you are looking in a localized place for very specific information that is almost the same as what's already there. So if you think about it, yeah, there's a lot of information, but if you know what kind of information you're supposed to be looking for, then at the end of the day, it's not really that much information, because most of the stuff there has nothing to do with the current topic at hand. Like, for example, in this question, you're only talking about proponents of this view. So you're only looking up here in the first place because this is other views and this is other views. So this tells you exactly where you should be looking. And also, you know what you're looking about. You're looking at the origin of the territories. So you don't really have to deal with that much information if you know what you're looking for and where. Like, same thing in this last passage that we looked at before this one. Suggest which of the following about most existing maps of Native American lands. Well, there's only a small region where they talk about most existing maps. So if you catch on to the fact that that's what you're talking about, then even though there's a lot of information in the passage as a whole, there's very little information that deals specifically with this. So the answer to the issue of how to know where to look is just to be very specific about what the question is asking. If the question is asking a question about this view and this topic, then you need to look exactly where those things are at. So, and it's also, same issue with this other question in the text box about the rest of the passage. I mean, if you are in the part of the passage that talks about what the question is talking about, then you found it. I mean, in other words, you don't really need to look elsewhere, because if you find it, you find it. So, Okay, let's take a look at, does anybody else have any other questions about this one? If you do, type them in the text box. Otherwise, let's move on to another one. Okay, let's look at another one. How about this one? Okay, I think everybody except Vasu has answered, so let's get an answer from Vasu. Vasu, Shri, there you go. Okay, here's the class answers, this time overwhelmingly in favor of the correct answer, so let's make this one a quicker discussion so that we can nail a couple more of these. So overwhelmingly B, that's what should happen. Let's take a look. You can infer, so basically infer as in prove, about women's relationship to politics. So you need to find localized information in the passage about women's relationship to politics. So women's relationship to politics is really not talked about for a very long time at all. It's discussed in exactly one place, which is at the very end of the passage. The only time where it discusses politics is down here at the very end. Clinging to the ideology of benevolence prevented these women from ever even attempting to gain true political power, because it implied a moral purity that precluded participation in them. I mean, there's some tough words in here. There's the preclude and you know, ideology prevented from it. It's not a super easy to read sentence. But what this means is that the women who held on to the ideology of female benevolence couldn't have political power. That's what it says. It says they were prevented from obtaining it. So this is basically exactly the same as answer B. I mean, what we have right now is, as long as they held on to this ideology, they could not have political power. So B says if they wanted political power, they would have to get rid of the ideology. Very true. Same thing. So how about that? As long as you don't have a microphone, you can't talk into your computer. Therefore, if you want to talk into your computer, you have to have a microphone. Very much the same thing. Well, it's both. The question is 19th century versus politics. I mean, the 19th century, I mean, they're both important, but what you have to realize in this case is that the entire passage here is about the 19th century U.S. Like, you have topic sentence way up here, this domesticity in the 19th century U.S. All of this is going on in the 19th century, because that's the context they give you up here, and there's no time changes in the passage, which means that the rest of the passage is also talking about this. So, I mean, yes, the 19th century is important, but the 19th century U.S. is the background for all of this stuff. Like, every single thing in this passage is in the 19th century United States. So your heart's in the right place, and in other passages that would matter. Like, if you had a passage where it shifted time frames a bunch of different times, then you would have to make sure you had your feet on the ground with respect to the time frame. And so you would have to make sure that you were talking about. I mean, yeah, it's a valid point. I guess we sort of glossed over that here. But it's kind of like in this last passage that we looked at. This one, no, not that one. In this passage, you know, we had 3 different views, and so you had to really make sure you were looking at the right view. But in some other passage, you might have only one view discussed in the whole passage, and so then you wouldn't have to be as careful about that. So same thing here, you have to not be as careful with time frames here because there are no changes of time frame. So as a result, that's not as much of an issue as it could be. But at the same time, it certainly could be an issue. It just isn't in this case. Okay. Good deal. Any other questions about this? Best and primary. Where are you looking? Where do you see those? For choices. Well, choice A is not really justified in the passage at all. Like it doesn't talk about, the passage doesn't talk about how women would get political power. It just talks about what prevented them from getting it. So choice A is not in any way, shape, or form justified because the passage doesn't talk about that. And then choice C, the issue is not so much primary. It's choice C is saying that they actually did abandon this. It was the cause of their eventual abandonment, which the passage doesn't say that. So in choice C, you're basically just making up the fact that they actually did abandon this ideology. So no, I mean you could totally have choices in which, I mean, if the question is can you eliminate just because those words are there, then the answer is no, definitely not. I mean there are definitely choices to certain questions in which those words are entirely justified. But here that's not the issue. The issue here is that we don't talk about any actual paths to political power at all. And the issue here in C is that we don't know that there was this abandonment in the first place. So there you go. But no, you cannot, there are no super quick fixes like that. There are no magic bullet type words that you can just look for and say automatically eliminate. It's not. Because it's reading comprehension. I mean, they really want to make sure that you do comprehend. And if the passage presents a statement that is extreme enough, then you may well have extreme choices that work. Okay, other questions? Otherwise, let's move on to another one. Okay, let's move on. Here's another one. This one, let me give you a little bit less time because it's shorter. So, go for it. Okay, the stopwatch has run out, so we should be picking an answer here pretty soon. Let's see, we are waiting on Dinesh and Raj. And that's it. So, those 2 individuals. Let's pick something. Okay, just Raj. So I guess we will, Raj, if that's you, make sure you know the GMAT doesn't allow you not to answer the problem. But here we go. Class answers, again, pretty overwhelming here. So I'm pretty sure you could get these in just about any order. So I think you may be slightly more likely to get main ideas first, but you should be prepared to get these in any order. Overwhelmingly A, storms that lend themselves to atmospheric measurements in general. So we need a statement about these kinds of storms in general. So where do they talk about storms that lend themselves to atmospheric measurements in general? So where do they do that? Well, they do it at the very, very beginning of the passage and then never again. Because the second paragraph is entirely about the hurricanes and tornadoes. So what they talk about is, this is actually the only time they ever mention that, is in the very, very, very first sentence. So the rest of it is just about hurricanes and tornadoes, and so is irrelevant. In other words, this part here, hurricanes and tornadoes, for example, are blah, 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 blah. This information in green is not relevant because it's not about those storms in general. This information is only for hurricanes and tornadoes. Not for such storms as a general rule. So the stuff contained in the green part is irrelevant because it's one example of these things. But the thing that we do know about these is that they are the storms that are most studied by climate professionals. So if they are the ones that, wait for it, this is a breathtaking moment of genius here, guys. If they're the ones that are most studied, then they are more likely to be studied than other stuff. Just let that sink in. I mean, that's how close these inference questions are. Like, it's for all practical purposes, it is totally saying exactly what the passage says in slightly different words. Passage says my brother is taller than me. Inference says I'm shorter than my brother. So the real issue here is just knowing where to look. If you found C, then you're not looking in the right place. If you found C, you're looking at that single example. Okay, any questions about this? Type in the text box. If there are no questions, we might have the time to do another one. So let's see. Yes, it does. It applies to just hurricanes and tornadoes, which is why it's not the right answer, because it doesn't apply to those kinds of storms in general. Okay. Let's see if we can knock out one more of these. Okay, let's see. Let's do this one. Go for it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's pick one. We're looking for Dinesh and the usual suspects here, Dinesh, Nishant, Raj. Remember, you got to stay within a certain time frame when you answer these things on the real test. So let's knock out an answer, even if we're not quite sure. Still waiting for Dinesh and Raj. Remember, those were the last two people last time as well. So for those two individuals in particular, make sure you know that the test is it's a time pressure intensive test. So depending on what's going on, you're going to have to school yourself to pick things quickly. Which means if you're guessing, just guess. I mean, a random guess that's made after 30 seconds is not any better than a random guess that's made after 5 seconds. So, okay. There's a Raj who hasn't answered yet. Remember, Raj, make sure you answer these things on test day. Here's the results. Still very good. Majority correct. Let's take a look. The only time they talk about for-profit hospital managers in particular is that one place. So you're basically looking for something that is equivalent to what is written here. So they generally work independently of hospital owners and thus may not make maximum financial efficiency their highest priority. So what is the answers that people picked are mostly D and E. We can dispose of E pretty quickly because E actually contradicts what is written there. Like it says they may not always make efficiency their highest priority. So this is at least somewhat contradictory to what's written here. Because this is talking about how they may not really care about efficiency, whereas here it's talking about how they do. But there's also, this is may not, as one of our readers is pointing out up there. May not is not definite. So you can't really make any definite statements based on non-definite statements. Yeah, this is too definite to be based on statements about may or may not. So there. All right. So if you financial efficiency must not be the same as maximizing profits, because otherwise choice E would be self-contradictory. I mean, if these two things were the same, then choice E would be saying they don't prioritize X even though they want to prioritize X, which is not, that doesn't make sense. So those must be two different things. Okay. What about conversely mentioned before that line? Well, anything before that line is not talking about for-profit hospital managers, so it doesn't really matter what is before that line. But, okay, as far as D, they generally work independently of hospital owners and thus, I mean, the key here is this word and thus. That's showing cause and effect. Because they work independently, their decisions are and thus means the same as therefore or as a result. So their decisions are a result of working independently of the hospital owners, which is equivalent to saying that they make decisions that are independent of what the hospital owners want. So it's pretty much the same thing as what's here. The decisions may not reflect the priorities of the hospital owners because they work independently of them, and thus they come up with their own things, which are not the same things that the hospital owners would want. So, question, service priorities, hospitals. Well, the decisions that they're talking about are, I mean, the entire passage is about services in the hospital industry. So the overarching context here is about services provided by hospitals. Like those are all of the decisions that the passage is dealing with here. The passage is about how hospitals make decisions about providing services in general. It's kind of like in that other example how the whole passage was about the 19th century, so it didn't have to say 19th century again. This is kind of the same thing. hospital services is the context of the entire passage, and so as a result, doesn't need to be mentioned again separately. But again, it's a good point. It's good to make sure that you're looking for that in there. But in this case, that's justified by the general context of what's going on here. Okay, we need to wrap up pretty soon. But hopefully you guys have gotten something out of this as far as the general functioning of these questions. I mean, you've mostly learned the lessons that, let me just make a quick wrap up here of what we've learned. So we can, there are more of these on file. We might do more next study hall unless there are other pressing issues and such. But so what we've learned about inferences. The first thing is they are, in almost all cases, they are basically equivalent to what is already there. So you should look for restatements or immediate consequences of what is in there, of existing statements. Also look in a localized area based on the particulars in the question. Because remember what they're very, very specific about this. It's, you know, if they say which one of these things is true about the dominant view of whatever topic, then as soon as they go into other views, you're going to start getting tricked into wrong answers. So make sure you keep a very firm handle on exactly what are we talking about. And there you go. So no new assumptions, and that's the deal. But the most important thing is this. The most important thing is these answers are basically equivalent to what the question already says, or what the passage already says. Which is, to close and recap, which is again not at all the same thing as what inference means to normal people. So make sure you know this. I mean, we're operating under a very strange definition of inference here, which diverges sharply from what inference means to normal individuals. So you got to keep that in mind. Okay, let's wrap up. If you have any quick questions that are basically business oriented, then you can go ahead and ask those quickly. Otherwise, let's close up shop and go from there. All right, I'm going to kill the recording. Thank you for coming. Record.